All right, guys. So today we are going to be looking at chapter 5 in your textbooks. So this is a little bit less about anatomy and physiology and a little bit more about human movement science. So Bay, a lot of this is going to look really familiar because this is going to be our kinesiology conversations that we've had. Lorianne, this is sort of, a lot of information on just like language stuff, right? Like it's literally about how we sort of communicate movement. We want to have very specific, very clear definitions of what it means to move in certain ways and stuff. And so that is why we sort of have our anatomic terminology. So a lot of these are going to be at anatomic locations at the start. It's going to be a lot of vocabulary today. Lots of like individual little like terms that we got to kind of get used to. And then, my recommendation is just to practice those terms and sort of use them as often as you can so that you can kind of get more and more and more familiar with speaking that language. We don't want to say we're raising our arms. We want to say we're abducting our arms. We don't want to, just raise our shoulder joint. We want to perform shoulder flexion. There's kind of some specific terminology here that makes it very clear as to what we're doing. And that way, when we describe what our muscles are, right, when we're describing like which muscles are doing which things, we're not going to be confused about like which muscles taking over, for instance, the hamstrings are a really good example of this, right? Like both hamstring muscles, you've got the medial side towards the inside part of the thigh, and you've got the lateral side towards the outside part of the thigh. Both of those hamstring muscles do knee flexion, right? Like both of them are in charge of like the hamstring curling action. But the ones that are on the medial side are also in charge of internal knee rotation, and the ones that are on the lateral side are in charge of external knee rotation. So we definitely need to know the difference between those two, and we need to be able to speak this very clear language in order to be able to separate them. Because if we look at a client whose knees are caving in, the reason this language is so important, if we look at someone whose knees are caving in like this, right, we got to remember like, okay, well, what's going on in this joint right here? Okay, that's external rotation, right? Like in relation to the femur, this tibia down here is externally rotated, right? It's just slightly outside in comparison. So that means that the medial hamstring is not doing enough work and the lateral hamstring is doing too much work, and it's causing that knee to cave in action. We're seeing that lateral hamstring muscle is the real problem here. And we know that because we know our terminology, we know our muscles, and we can sort of look at that. So that's sort of what we're going to be going over today. We're going to be looking a lot at these biomechanical terms. So our purpose today, get a fundamental overview of how the entire human movement system works in order to like produce movement, learn movement, and things like that. After we're done today, our objectives are to be able to kind of describe our biomechanic terminology. So we do want to understand sort of like how we are moving through specific planes of motions, different joint actions, muscle actions, how all those things are kind of related to, this branch of science. How forces in the world are going to sort of interact with our human movement system. An overview of what we call motor behavior at the very end, which will be kind of fun. We'll talk a little bit about like how we learn these specific movements. And then we will talk about like a little bit about sensory information, how that sensory information sort of determines how we move. So looking at the human movement system, right? Obviously, we know that it needs to be aware of its surrounding environment, right? Like we talked about how important, when we were talking about the nervous system, we talked about how important proprioception is, right? Proprioception is your body's ability to understand where it is in space, right? It's going to gather information about both the internal environment inside your body, but also the external environment that your body is sort of interacting with. And so it needs to be able to gather any necessary information about those environments and then execute the responses that are most appropriate to that, right? So if I grab like a 10-pound dumbbell and I want to raise it up over my head, my body needs to be able to sense how much weight is in my hand, and it needs to be able to generate enough force to raise that dumbbell, but not too much force, because then, you know, it might go flying out of my hand, right? So it needs to be able to sort of learn information about the external environment, and then how to interact with that external environment, you know, with my body. And that all of that kind of comes together to ensure that we move the way that we're really designed to move, right? That we're really sort of supposed to move. So one of the big key terms that we're going to be using here is biomechanics, right? And so biomechanics is the motions that the kinetic chain is producing and the forces that are acting upon it. And so when we say what biomechanics are, right, it's biomechanics are literally your movements, right? It is every movement that you make is a biomechanic action. However, it's also where those movements that you create sort of intersect and interact with our environment, right? Like how those things are also like sort of interacting with the external environment outside of our body, right? Again, how do my muscles generate 10 pounds of force to raise like a 10-pound dumbbell? How do I grab a doorknob and, you know, contract muscles to create like supination so that I can open that doorknob? You know, or if that doorknob's on backwards, pronation. So like, you know, that's what we're looking at in biomechanics. It's the motions that we produce, but also the forces that are acting upon those motions. So obviously, like, we are very good at particular movements. You know, our joints are really supposed to move in very specific ways, but unfortunately, over like through repetition and poor habits and things like that, we kind of start moving in ways that we're really not designed to move, ways that we can move, but are not necessarily as efficient. And so what happens is if we're moving in a very inefficient way, our biomechanics get messed up, right? Like basically we are putting too much force in specific parts of our body, right? Kind of the classic example is to look at like an anterior pelvic tilt, that lower cross syndrome that we've talked about so many times. Kind of a good example of like looking at this, actually, if you look at a skeleton version, you can see this is putting too much pressure on certain parts of the spine and not enough pressure on others, and then too much pressure in other parts of the spine again. Your spine literally has to kind of do this extra curving action in order to compensate for the weight. So because you've got tight hip muscles, or maybe weak glute muscles, or tight low back muscles, or weak ab muscles, because those things might be happening, you can see we're putting way too much pressure on certain parts of the spine. And so what'll happen here is you're going to move in ways that you're really not designed to move, and it could cause like an overuse injury. Trying to get a good picture. Let's see here. Spinal discs. Let's see, like a zoomed in version. Actually, yeah, here, so you can kind of see this, right? Like you can actually see, you know, the amount of space in between the discs here, right? So if there's like a posterior tilt, which we're seeing here, this is a posterior pelvic tilt, and this is an anterior pelvic tilt, you know, there should be about an even amount of space in the discs here. Like if we're sitting nice and upright, you know, we want this Jenga stack, you know, to kind of be well balanced and go straight up, right? Your spinal discs, for the most part, should be pretty even from one side to the other. But what we're seeing instead with an anterior tilt is we're seeing sort of this collapsing action in the back. And so this part of the disc is grinding. And in a posterior pelvic tilt, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're seeing a grinding action in the front. So both of those are not great, right? Like both of those are definitely going to lead to some aches and pains or instability in the core. It's going to lead to an alteration in proprioception, which is going to negatively affect your balance and the way we move. It has negative repercussions in everything. And so we do want to make sure that we understand what the ideal resting position of the human body is, so we can get our clients back to that ideal resting position whenever they sort of stray outside of those norms. So big terminology that we are going to look at. We are definitely going to be looking at our anatomic location. So Anatomic locations are specific places on the body. This again allows us to have like effective communication. Like when I say, we've got our medial hamstring muscle versus our lateral hamstring muscle, we need to understand like what those two terms mean and how they are different from one another, right? When I say that we've got a superior portion of something versus an inferior portion of something, we need to be able to understand that. And we speak this very, very clear language. We use these anatomic terms because when we're really clear like this, there's never any room for interpretation, right? There's a video that we're going to watch next mod, or maybe in 2 mods, but that breaks it down really well, where he used the analogy of like if you swallowed a toothpick, right, and it gets lodged somewhere in your esophagus, your doctor does like an x-ray and figures out, like finds that toothpick, and he needs to tell the surgeon exactly where it is. He's not just going to say like, oh, it's in his neck, just below the shoulders, right? Like that's not a very accurate description. What he would probably say is, it is along the medial line, which is, like right here, within the esophagus, or maybe within the trachea or whatever. And it would be, superior to the sternum, but inferior to, and then maybe he says like, one of your specific like spinal discs, right? And that's going to give that doctor a very clear idea of like where it's at. We would say maybe posterior to obviously your breastbone, but anterior to your spinal disc as well, because that's where your trachea is. So that very specific language means that like, these two medical professionals were able to communicate like really, really effectively. Well, we use the same terms. We use the same, very clear anatomic locations in order to describe things, because it takes all of the interpretation out of things. It also gives us a very basic position from which to describe everything. So actually, hold on just 1 second. Where the heck does it say? Oh, that's fine. I'm actually not seeing a term that I think is really important. So before we get started, yeah, anatomic location's not on here, or anatomic position rather. So, all right. So one thing before we get started, I do want to mention all of these terms, by the way, are from the anatomic position. Okay, so every term that we are going to use is in relation to a human body that is standing exactly like this, with feet hip width apart, toes pointed forward, arms resting at their sides, palms facing forward, head in a neutral position. So this is the anatomic position. So when I say something is superior to something else, which means that it's above something else, right? Like your pectorals are superior to your abdominals, right? When I say something like that, I am always, always, always referring to those things from the anatomic position, not any other position, right? Now, well, you could argue, it's like, well, what if they're doing a handstand? Now their pecs are below their abdominals because they're standing on their hands, right? They're upside down. Nope, that doesn't happen. We know that the only time I'm ever calling something superior is its position from the anatomic position. It is like the resting place right here. So again, the reason we do that is because that takes any interpretation out of the conversation. It takes interpretation away immediately. We know exactly where we are talking about things because we refer to them only in the position that they are in the anatomic position. So that's the anatomic position. So let's go ahead and talk about some of our terms here. So we've got superior, which we've already mentioned, which is going to be a position above a point of reference. So when we say something is superior to something else, we're saying that it is above whatever it is that we are referencing from the anatomic position. So your head, for instance, is superior to pretty much everything else on the rest of your body. It's the most superior thing that you've got. And then we've got inferior, which is a position below a point of reference. So your pelvis, right, your hip bones are inferior to your rib cage because they are below it. Your feet are pretty much the most inferior thing you've got on your body, right? So, excuse me. Superior is a position above, inferior is a position below. Now, if there is no point of reference given, if we're just saying something is generally superior, we are going to mean that it is either above or below your midline. So if we look at the, let's see here, planes. We'll actually see these planes come up again here in just a moment. But for now, can we get a higher quality picture? There we go. If no frame of reference is given, basically everything above like your pelvis would be considered just naturally superior, and everything below it would be considered inferior. So again, superior is above, inferior is below. Then we have got anterior versus posterior. Anterior is going to be a position on the front of the body. So again, like your pectoral muscles are anterior, your abdominals are anterior, your face is anterior, right? Like all the stuff that is on the front of the body. And then posterior is a position on the back of the body. Your glutes are posterior, your hamstrings are posterior, calf muscles, upper back, lower back, all of those things are posterior. So anterior is on the front, posterior is on the back. Again, if we're talking about the anatomic position, that's arms resting at your sides, your biceps are anterior and your triceps are posterior. Then we've got medial and lateral. Medial and lateral are a little bit different, but they are either medial is a position relatively closer to the midline of the body, and lateral is a position that's relatively farther from the midline of the body. And this only moves in like a horizontal fashion, right? So you're basically like, becoming more medial or you are becoming more lateral. And so it's going like this, right? Like if I'm doing like a chest fly, right? I am bringing my palms from a lateral position to a medial position, and then I would bring those back, right? That is the difference in medial and lateral, and they only move side to side like this in terms of your reference. The reason that's important is because we're going to see proximal and distal here in just a second. So if superior and inferior can only move up and down, medial and lateral can only move side to side. But rather than just being like, up and down is just kind of sort of like an elevator. Medial and lateral sort of like it does a reset once it gets to the midline. Because if I were to cross something, over from one side to the other, you would think that would mean that now suddenly like my arm is being medial, and then it crossed over my midline, and then suddenly it's going lateral, 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 lateral. But that's not true, because again, we are referencing everything from the anatomic position. So if I were, let's say in this position here, right, and I cross all the way over like this, right, I'm still bringing this, even further medial, right? So medial is a position relatively closer to the midline. Lateral is a position that's relatively farther from the midline. Then we have got proximal and distal. Now, these are kind of interesting because these are sort of like combination terms. Proximal is a position nearest the center of the body. Now, I've been saying midline, right? And that's a very clear distinction because it's the line that literally divides you in half, right? Like if we look at it, right, this is our midline, okay? And then this was also our midline, right? So we've got like our vertical midline and our horizontal midline. Well, if I am moving towards the center where these two things are meeting, right? If I get closer to the center where these two spots both intersect, that would be something that is considered proximal. So it's within proximity to the very center of something. It's the bullseye. versus if I were moving further away from that, which would be considered distal. Okay, so distal would be a position farther from the center, right? Or you can use proximal and distal in terms of point of reference, right? So if you were to say, for instance, like one thing is closer to another thing, you could use proximal and distal, right? Like I would say my right eyeball is more proximal to my nose and more distal to my left eyeball, right? Like they're on the same line, like in terms of superior, inferior. But like this is sort of like in the middle. So both of these things are closer to this than they are to each other. So that's another way that you can kind of use proximal and distal. Generally, though, the most common way that we will use proximal and distal is when we are describing like your arms and your legs. So you want to think of it as, the way I always like to think of it as, think of it as like almost like a highway. Like your body has to like travel back to wherever it's going. So it's got to get to your center, right? So if I were standing in the anatomic position like this, right, and you wanted to get from my elbow back to my center, and you had to kind of drive up my arm, you know, because it's not connected, right? You'd have to drive up my arm and then come down. My elbow is further away. That trip is much longer than if you were to travel just from my shoulder straight back to my center. So if I were to travel from the elbow, this would be considered distal because it's it's a further distance. And this is closer to my center, so it's more proximal. So your elbow is more proximal compared to your wrist, but it is more distal compared to your shoulder because this has to travel further. This has to travel kind of a medium distance. This has to travel like hardly any distance at all. So that's where we kind of get those terms, right? So let's go ahead and one of the ways I like to look at this too, by the way, is I like to I usually draw this chart in class. Whenever I'm thinking about like the differences between like, you know, medial and lateral and proximal and distal and superior and inferior and stuff, I always like to kind of draw just like a circle. And you can kind of imagine like where you are at in that circle, right? So if we imagine, that's not what I want. That's what I want. So if we imagine like being closer to the midline, right? Something like this, that would be considered medial. You know what am I doing? I can literally have a type function. This would be considered medial. And then if we were like further away from that midline, going in totally the opposite direction, you know, like let's say we're going like this, that would be considered lateral. And then if we were above this line, you know, going upwards, this would be considered superior. And if we were below that line, we would consider that inferior. So that's medial, lateral, superior, inferior. If we considered something, and you'll notice again, these only move like horizontally if it's medial, lateral, or vertically if it's superior, inferior, right? But proximal and distal are kind of special. They can go like this. You've got proximal, which is going to be closer to the center. Okay, that's proximal. Versus distal, which would be farther away from the center. So if we're moving away, and it's at kind of an angle like that, right? Like that's distal. So that is, those are sort of our kind of our biggest terms. We've got a couple other ones here. Oh, and then obviously in a two-dimensional circle, I can't draw anterior and posterior. Anterior is on the front, posterior is on the back. If I knew how to do like, you know, I know that like obviously that people can add freaking 3D stuff by doing fancy little circle. It's above my, I have no idea. I can't draw. So those are sort of our terms, right? Superior is a position above, your head is superior. Inferior is a position below. Your pelvis is inferior to your rib cage. Anterior is on the front, your pecs are anterior. Posterior is on the back, your scapula is posterior. Medial is closer to the midline, so your sternum, that's about as medial as it gets. Your heart is very medial, although it kind of tilts slightly to the left side. Or lateral, right? Your eyes are more lateral compared with your nose. Your nose is dead center, your eyes are lateral. Proximal is nearest the center of the body. So again, this is one that you have to say, my wrist is proximal if you're comparing it to my fingers, but it is distal if you are comparing it to my elbow, because this is obviously, my wrist is obviously closer than my fingertips, but my wrist is farther away compared to my elbow. So the elbow is proximal to the wrist. The ankle is distal compared to the knee. And then there is two special terms here that don't get used that often, but there's contralateral and ipsilateral. Contralateral is, it's not so much like just like a position on the body, it's a position in reference to another position. So for the most part, we're pretty symmetrical, like we kind of have everything on two sides. So we have sort of a contralateral version of everything. I've got my left ear and I've got my right ear. That means they are contralateral. So it's a position on the opposite side of the body. My left ear is contralateral to my right ear, right? My right hand is contralateral to my left hand. And then we have ipsilateral, which is a position on the same side of the body. So your right hand is ipsilateral to your right foot. So a lot of times, the only, where we will often see those terms get used is when we are looking at like injuries or movement compensations. For instance, we know that lateral ankle sprain, right, which would be an ankle sprain on the outside portion of the ankle, right, because lateral means further from the midline. So a lateral ankle sprain, which would be in these little ligaments right here. It would be from rolling the ankle like this and overstretching this ATL ligament. So let's say that happens. We know one of the ways we use contralateral, ipsilateral is that lateral ankle sprains often result in ipsilateral glute weakness. So what will happen is the glute on the same side as that ankle, basically because they are babying their ankle and they're not stepping very hard, they end up losing a little bit of glute strength. And then that can cause like an asymmetric shift in the hips. And weirdly enough, this can cause contralateral pain in the low back. And so weirdly, your right ankle being sprained will cause right glute weakness, which will cause left low back pain. So those terms don't come up that often, but they are kind of important. I mean, obviously all of them are important. So, oh Lord, that's not what I want. Like that. Okay. And then actually we'll pull up this one as well. Ah, don't save it. God dang it. All right. Next thing we got, actually, any questions on any of that so far? The three of you guys feeling pretty good?
Yeah.
Cool, cool. All right.
No, I'm good.
Cool. Oh, awesome.
I got to the VA right now, so I'm just gonna go find a seat.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, I'm with you.
Uh-oh. Someone's backing up. All right. So let's take a look at our planes of motion. So the next thing we got to look at is we got to analyze like where most of our movement occurs. For the most part, human movement is going to occur in these three major planes of motion. Now, obviously, like no movement strictly occurs, in one plane or another. We're sort of, even if you were to look at like just straight up elbow flexion, right? If you were doing like even just the most perfect curls that you can do, there's probably a little bit of like rotational movement that's going to occur there, but for the most part, we consider most of our movement to kind of predominantly move through one plane or another. So as we are looking at this, we are looking about how like our movement sort of moves parallel to the plane that we're talking about. So we are sort of sliding in the same direction as our plane is, right? And so if we look at our 3 planes of motion here, we're going to see that we have a frontal plane, a sagittal plane, and a transverse plane. And those 3 planes of motion, like I said, are where most of our movement occurs. So we'll go ahead and start with the sagittal plane because that tends to be the one that we almost always talk about first. So your sagittal plane is going to divide you into a left side and a right side. So you're going to get basically cut down the middle like this, right? Like this zipper I've got right here is perfectly, sort of representing my sagittal plane. And so you want to imagine it as this plane. It's like a sheet of glass that kind of travels down your midline, and it travels infinitely in that direction and infinitely in that direction. And so I am going to move parallel to that plane of motion. So I'm going to move in things like this or like this, right? These are both sagittal movements. If I'm nodding my head, yes and no, right? That's a sagittal movement. If I'm bending over at the waist or extending at the waist, right? Those are all sagittal movements because I'm moving in the direction of that plane, right? You can even sort of practice this if you ever want to like remember if something is a sagittal movement. Go up to a door and just kind of, or a wall, and just line yourself up next to it. And then like anytime you are sliding along that wall, right? Like a bicep curl or even a squatting motion, right? Like you'd be sliding along it. Those are all sagittal plane movements. So walking frontwards or walking backwards, right? Like walking forward or walking backwards, you are walking sagittally. You're doing a little bit of hip flexion and things like that. And so we have some terms there that we are going to use, but that is moving along the sagittal plane. So sagittal plane divides you into left and right halves. Good examples of this are, like I said, any movement that would be considered like flexion or any movement that is considered extension, those are sagittal plane movements. So any version of flexion, whether it's, elbow flexion, shoulder flexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, even like ankle plantar flexion, or ankle dorsiflexion, all of those movements occur in the sagittal plane. And then you have got the frontal plane, and the frontal plane is going to divide you into a front and a back half. So you can see here, is sort of cutting this person down the middle here like this, right? So now we've got a back half and a front half. That is our frontal plane. So the frontal plane, you're going to move along it, right? So again, if you're doing something like this, like side to side movements, right? Those are frontal plane movements. If I'm dropping my head side to side, like bobbing it like this, right? Those are frontal plane movements. If I take my arms and abduct them, or if I adduct them, abduction, adduction, those are frontal plane movements. So again, moving along the plane. So if I go line myself up at the wall, and I do something like this, right? If I move my leg out like that, that's abduction, adduction, right? If I move my arms to the side like this, there's stuff in my way. That is how that works, right? So frontal plane movements, weirdly enough, are side to side movements, right? Because you are moving parallel to the plane. And then we've got transverse movements. Transverse movements are where you are going to be divided into an upper portion and a lower portion. So you're going to move along the plane sort of like this, right? These rotational actions. So, oh, Lord. Oh, my God. Oh, good Lord.
Ah, are you okay?
My morning cereal is trying to kill me. Oh, no.
Are you okay, Brad?
Yeah, I'm good. Oh, just out of nowhere, just a piece of like, cereal that was probably like lodged in a tooth or something, just grabbed the back of my uvula. Oh, oh my goodness. Whoa. All right, we're good.
Only one of us only at the emergency room.
Yeah, no kidding. gosh. Okay, we're good. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. I can always feel it back there, like every morning. And I'm like, usually doesn't give me any trouble. All right. So transverse plane movements, upper and lower halves, right? So moving along rotational movements, right? If I have my hands just resting like this and I rotate my palms, right? That's transverse movements, or rotating my head. So the neck is so great because it can do all these, right? You've got sagittal movements, you've got transverse movements, and you've got frontal movements. Okay, so when we're thinking about these things, we kind of have like these specific these specific movements, these specific actions that really can only occur in these planes of motion, right? Like abduction and adduction are frontal plane movements, right? Flexion and extension are sagittal plane movements, and then internal rotation or external rotation, external rotation, those are transverse plane movements. Okay. Now there are two special ones for the transverse one. There's actually special ones for all of them, but they're the two special ones that we deal with a lot are also going to be horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. So horizontal abduction is still like you're moving away from, you remember abduction is you're moving away from your midline, right? Adduction is you're moving towards your midline. Well, imagine if you were doing that, but horizontally. Well, away from my midline would be horizontal abduction, and moving towards my midline would be horizontal adduction. And that only occurs in your shoulder joint. So it gets your shoulder joint is so freaking mobile, it kind of gets its own special terms there. But they are still transverse plane movements, right? If you imagine, if something divided me into an upper and lower half, I'd be moving transverse along it, right? And then there are some special scapular movements as well. Your scapula, your shoulder girdle, is a pretty freaking cool bone that allows us to have like a lot of extra movement here. And so you are going to have sort of four key movements here. You are going to see scapular retraction, which is pulling your shoulder blades back. You're also going to see scapular protraction, which is doing the opposite. That's rounding your shoulders around the front of the body. You're going to see scapular elevation, which would be like elevating your scapula and raising it up towards the ceiling. Or you are going to see scapular depression, which would be dropping it down. So generally, when we're describing a good resting position, your scapula should be retracted and depressed slightly. And that should be really like where we start most of our movements from. So those are our key movements in and our planes of motion. Any questions on that? Nope, sounds like we're good. Okay.
I'm good.
All righty. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at our muscle actions. So, all right, if those are the movements, now we're going to kind of pivot here and we're going to take a look at like, how do our muscles create these movements, right? We've talked about how, your muscles job, like all those movements are bone movements, right? Like we're describing, like when I say flexion, right, I'm talking about two bones, pivoting along each other, right? Like kind of doing this hinging action, right? Or when I talk about like rotation, right? All those things are bone movements, okay? But we need to look at how your muscles are what move your bones around. So they're actually the ones responsible for these movements. And so luckily muscles are really, really good at this thanks to all the anatomy that we were talking about the other day, right? Remember we were looking at like muscle fibers. I can't remember what I look at. Oh, you know what? Fascicle. Yeah, yeah, fascicle arrangement. That's what, oh, actually, that's not what worked. What did I freaking look up? Muscle organ anatomy. That has got to pull it up right now. Oh yeah, there we go. So remember all the like individual, hey, Oregon State, all the individual pieces we talked about, right? You've got a muscle fiber, which has these myofibrils that run end to end. And then that muscle fiber is tied up with a bunch of other muscle fibers. And then they're all bundled together in what's called a fascicle. And then that fascicle is bound together with a bunch of other fascicles. And that's what actually makes up your muscle. So luckily, this arrangement and having all of these like actin and myosin proteins make our muscle organs really, really, really good at contracting and relaxing, right? They're really good at sort of shortening themselves and then lengthening themselves back to a resting position. So, and then when we look at these muscles, they're all arranged with like a tendon, right? They all sort of end in a tendon, and that tendon is going to tie from one bone to another, right? So if we look at like, let's see if this works actually. I mean, yeah, close. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So if we take a look right here, right, we can see we've got our biceps muscle here. This is our biceps brachii, and it's got a tendon that runs onto your scapula right here, and then this tendon runs up and over and also grabs onto your scapula right here. And so then this is going to run down and it's going to grab your forearm down here, right? This is going to grab onto your ulna. And so when we look at like how that attaches, right, it's running from one tendon to another. So that arrangement means that these muscles, which are really good at like shortening and relaxing, they're attached to our bones. That's how they're dragging us around, creating this movement, right? So every muscle action you create. So here's the thing that we got to remember though, and this is just sort of a general rule of thumb. You're not going to find this in your textbook, but it'll really help with our understanding of muscles. Remember this about muscles, guys. Muscles can only pull. That's the only thing they can do. They can shorten themselves and pull and create like a contraction, right? So when a muscle slides and shortens and pulls, right, it drags the bones. Then your muscles can relax back to their original length, but they cannot push. Okay, so my bicep muscle cannot push my elbow back into its other leg. It can only relax. And then luckily, I've got an exact opposite muscle on the other side of the joint, and it's going to pull. And that's how I'm going to get back to my neutral position. So remember that muscles can only pull in terms of like, you know, being a very active thing. But they can relax and they can stabilize. They can sort of hold themselves in one position, or they can sort of lengthen out. So that's where we get our three muscle actions, the three things that our muscles can do. So the first one we'll talk about is actually not even the pulling part. We'll actually talk about the lengthening part first. So we're going to talk about eccentric contractions or eccentric contractions. You'll sometimes hear people say, but eccentric contractions are contractions that occur when a muscle is lengthening. So when you are lengthening a muscle back to its neutral position, right? Let's say it was bunched up like this, and then you are lengthening it back to normal, right? That is an eccentric type contraction. So eccentric contractions are associated with like force reduction, right? Imagine I have like 20-pound dumbbells in both hands, and I took them up over my head like this, right? If I were to create, let's say 19 pounds of force instead of 20, what's going to happen is they're going to slowly sort of overcome the amount of force that my shoulders are generating, and I'm reducing their force back down to the ground, right? So I'm performing force reduction. Or my muscle is generating less tension, less tensive force than the resistive force that I got in my hand. Okay, so that would be an eccentric muscle contraction, lengthening out my muscle. Now, I could generate a completely equal amount of force as well. And that's what we're going to get with isometric contractions. So isometric contractions are contractions that occur when a muscle is maintaining a specific length. So let's say like I've got that 20-pound dumbbell in my hand and I generate exactly 20 pounds of force, then I can just hold that dumbbell like this, however long I can generate 20 pounds of force, right? If I just hold it right here, I'm generating an equal amount of tension in my muscle in comparison to the resistive force. So my muscle is maintaining a specific length. That again is force stabilization. So if I had like two dumbbells in my hand and I raise them up like this and I just decide to hold this here, that would be an isometric contraction. So force reduction is eccentric. Force stabilization is isometric. So your muscle is generating an equal amount of force. Now, there's a special little term that I threw in here. This actually isn't in your PowerPoint, and you're probably not going to be tested on it in this class. But it comes up at the end of the module, so I always like to mention it. There is sort of a special phase here sometimes within a lift, which is called amortization. Amortization is a stabilizing transition phase that occurs when you are switching between like eccentric and concentric. So if I'm doing like my elbows like this, and I'm not taking any pauses, really, I'm not like trying to take any specific pauses. That lack of pause means that like I do like in the joint, I do just like a little bit of stabilizing as I'm sort of handing the reins off from like, you know, pulling to like relaxing, right? And so that little bit of stabilizing that happens is called amortization. It's a form of isometric contraction, but it happens in like a split second. Whereas like isometric contractions, you can hold a plank for, you know, a couple minutes. I think the world record is like 4.5 hours or something, which is crazy. So, you know, you can hold isometrics for a very, very, very long time, but amortization is like a transitionary movement where you really aren't holding your joint in a specific position, but you are stabilizing it. So this is a really important concept when we are talking about like plyometrics. When we're talking about like explosive, jumping, you know, fast movements, one of the keys to being as explosive as possible is to have a really fast amortization, okay? To have a really, really, really fast transitionary period. So the faster your amortization is, as you are like lengthening a muscle out, when you perform really rapid eccentric contractions, your nervous system actually kind of panics a little bit. And so it has this kind of knee-jerk reaction where it will contract that muscle in response, which if you are transitioning very quickly, then you can take advantage of that contraction much faster. So you get a much better, the shorter your amortization is, the stronger your plyometric like jump will be. Okay. So that's amortization in a nutshell. It's part of isometric. So we've lengthened our muscle, we've stabilized our muscle. Now we got to do the one that we typically associate with muscle contractions, which is concentric contractions. Concentric contractions occur when a muscle is shortening. So we typically associate this with force production, right? I have a 10-pound dumbbell in my hand. I generate 11 pounds of force. I overcome it, right? So the muscle is generating a greater amount of force than a resistance. So if you were to, you know, if I had to arm wrestle, let's say, you know, Ronnie Coleman, right? If I had to arm wrestle like a professional bodybuilder, right? You know, they're probably going to be able to generate much more force than I am. So I'm probably going to be trying to concentrically produce enough force, you know, to drive their arm down. But unfortunately, the amount of force they're generating is greater than the amount of force I'll probably be able to generate. So what's actually going to happen is I'm going to eccentrically lengthen instead, right? So that's the big difference, right? Concentric is shortening, eccentric is lengthening, isometric is stabilizing. So the reason this arrangement is so important, and the reason we need to understand this is so important, is because your muscles in your body, I remember I said they can only pull, right? So that means that every muscle in your body has to have an exact opposite. You have to have, for every Batman, there has to be a Joker. For every Superman, there needs to be a Lex Luthor. You know, every muscle's got to have its total opposite on the other side of the joint. And so we want to have a good relationship, you know, unlike those superheroes and supervillains I just mentioned. We want to have a good relationship between those two muscles. Your agonist and your antagonist, even though they are totally opposites of each other, they really should be working together to create effective human movement. But what often happens is one muscle becomes a little bit overactive. It starts to really take a little bit more territory than it really should. And then it starts to kind of passively contract all day long. And so it just gets into this concentric contraction and kind of stays that way. Meanwhile, the antagonist muscle, you know, it's attached to the same bone on the other side. So it ends up getting dragged into a lengthened position. It gets stretched out. And so it is doing an eccentric contraction pretty much all day, eccentrically losing, you know, length. So what happens there is we see what's called an altered length tension relationship, where you'll see one muscle will be contracting and another muscle will be relaxing when they really should both be, you know, sort of in a neutral position. So we start to see something that kind of looks like this. If you imagine these two muscles right here, you know, on one side of a joint, like this is a good balance, right? Like these muscles are nice and equal right here. They're both contracting for the same amount. But if this one starts contracting for too much and this one can't contract enough because of that, well, now you've got a messed up joint that rests in this position, and now maybe you've got rounded shoulders, or maybe you've got a posterior pelvic tilt or an anterior pelvic tilt, right? Maybe you've got a forward head posture. Something's happening where one muscle's contracting too much and the other muscle is not contracting enough. So the traditional theory behind the way muscles work is a lot of people think that muscles just contract, right? They only really work that way. And so we got to remember that, like, I mean, this is really important. Our muscles work in all through an entire spectrum of concentric, eccentric, and isometric movements. We don't want to be those people in the gym who are lifting like this, right? They got this big heavy weight and they're like, and they generate a whole bunch of concentric force and then they just drop it and they don't do any eccentric, right? You just trained your deltoid muscle to only shorten. You didn't teach it how to lengthen. So that's going to only lead to overactivity in those muscles. Those muscles are going to get really good at, you know, shortening, but they're not going to be good at lengthening, which means they're probably just going to want to stay in a shortened state. That's going to drag the antagonist on the other side of your joint into a weakened position, which is not great, right? That's going to lead to poor posture. When we look at that, again, the one of the best examples is an anterior pelvic tilt. What we're going to see here, on the right, is we are going to see, like, if my gluteus maximus, or if my psoas is really tight, if my hip flexors are really, really tight, you know, and they're pulling like this, that is going to lengthen out my gluteus maximus. So now my glutes are weak and my hips are tight. Or let's say it's right here, right? If my low back is really tight and my abs are weak, right? Tight low back, weak abdominals, messed up joint action, right? So that's sort of what we're looking at when we're looking at these things. Now, we are trying to generate as much force in our muscles as possible. When I say that, right, what I mean is like that's your muscle's entire job, right? Your muscles are these really cool little organs that have these specialized proteins in them that allow them to contract and relax. Well, they can't do that effectively if they are not in an ideal resting position. So when we're talking about like what force is sort of the physics definition is the interaction between two entities that results in either acceleration or deceleration of an object. It's a true definition. I don't find it all that helpful. What force is like when one thing is able to generate a little bit of kinetic energy and it either accelerates or decelerates, it moves another object. So your muscles generate a little bit of kinetic energy and they move things, right? Like my water bottle here. If I generate force in my bicep, it will contract and bring it towards my mouth, right? So I'm generating enough force to overcome this resistance. Now, if my water bottle weighed like 6,000 pounds, right, I wouldn't be able to generate enough force in this muscle, at least not without some training first, right? So your human movement system, your kinetic chain, is designed to be able to generate force and manipulate these things around us, right? That again is our definition of biomechanics. And so we need to understand, like, you know, how to ideally generate force. Well, one of the concepts to understand this, one of the biggest ways that we have to understand like generating force is looking at what is called a length tension relationship. Okay, so a length tension relationship is the length of a muscle and the greatest amount of tension that that muscle can generate at that length. Okay, so it's the length at which a muscle can produce its the most amount of force. Okay, so whoops. So if a muscle is over lengthened, it can't generate force. Not very well, at least. And if a muscle's over shortened, it also can't generate force very well. And we'll look at why. Let's take a look at this in just a second. But a length tension relationship is the resting length of a muscle and the length at which a muscle can produce the greatest amount of force. So here's why that is the case. If we look at length tension, it's going to be kind of a chart. You can see this is the same chart here in this picture here. But it looks something kind of like this. All right, well, here's half of what I'm looking for. So take a look right here. If you look at this picture, right, here we can see our actin and myosin proteins, right? We got the little yellow actin strands here. That's the thin strand. We got this really thick strand of myosin with little heads that want to reach up, right? Now, right here, you can see there's a really good amount of overlap between actin and myosin. There's a little gap here, right? And so what's going to happen is those myosin heads are going to reach up. They're going to grab the actin, and they're going to pull it towards the center. I'll actually copy this picture. We'll kind of chart this out here. So, you know, what's going to happen, and I'll just like a bright red, is that, like, you know, these little heads are going to pull, and they're going to grab those proteins, and it's going to pull it this way and this way, right? And so this is going to shorten. So now there's going to be a limited amount of space eventually. Once this starts pulling, you can see now those proteins are all overlapped, right? Actin and myosin are all the way, you know, actin's got nowhere to go. It's hitting the midline. Like, see this right here? It's hitting its midline, right? It really can't go much further. And also there's not very much room to move over here either. So that's great if that muscle's fully contracted. You know, imagine it like this, right? Like look at my bicep here. It bunches up, right? That is a full, all those proteins are now slid across each other, which is why like it looks all bunched up like that. So that's great if I mean to do it that way. But here's the thing. What if your muscle gets so used to contracting that it already sort of passively is in this position like this, right? What if it's kind of stuck like that? Well, now you've got a muscle that we consider overactive. You've got a muscle that has an altered length tension relationship and it won't relax anymore. So now what's going to happen is you've got muscles that are not going to be able to contract enough, right? So we can see here in this picture, right? This is a really shortened muscle. And on the other side of the joint, you're going to see something like this, right? Like actin and myosin are already way too bunched up, right? These are fully bunched up. All there. There's no overlapping that can occur anymore. There's no sliding that can occur. Now there's lots of room to slide, right? There's a little gap between these fibers here, right? But then you get down here and it's like, ooh, man, there's a big gap, which is great. We got plenty of room to move. But unfortunately, there's actually not a very good grip. Myosin can't reach up and grab the actin strands. They're pulled too far apart. So we kind of want to have a good balance here between our actin and myosin overlap. Trying to find the picture I want to find. It's actually kind of difficult. There we go. Perfect. So here you can see like this is ideal. We got a really good amount of overlap here. We got plenty of room to move, right? This is an underactive muscle, right? That's a muscle that can barely get a grip here. There's plenty of room to move, which is good. But unfortunately, there's certain myosin heads have nothing to grab because this muscle fiber is pulled too far apart. And over here in our overactive muscle, we can see there's too much overlap, and now there's not enough room to move. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of modify this. So if you imagine our overactive underactive situation, that kind of looks like this, right? Now imagine on a cellular level, it kind of looks like this. All right. So we've got this overactive muscle here. Uh-oh. I'm running out of room. Let's start with the underactive one. We got this sort of underactive muscle on this side of the joint that really, like I said, is just not pulling as much as it should be, right? I really wish I could just, what does this do? Trying to figure out how to draw a freaking chart here in real time. I don't think that's going to help me. If we rotate you 90 degrees, does that work? Not really. All right. Well, anyway, here's our underactive muscle on this side of the joint. It's not grabbing enough. And here's an overactive muscle over here. One day we'll be back at Sochi. I'll have a freaking whiteboard where I can draw things. So it kind of looks like this, sort of. Altered joint angle rather than a perfect ideal 90 degrees. That was a huge failure. So looking at this right here, this is sort of what this looks like. So we want to have an ideal resting length. We don't want to have altered length tension relationships. We want to have ideal length tension relationships. We want to have the greatest degree of overlap between actin and myosin fibers in both muscles, right? I want my actin and myosin to have an ideal overlap. If they have too much overlap, they can't move. That's a weak muscle. If they don't have enough overlap, they can't grab each other. That is also a weak muscle. So there's sort of a contradictory there's a sort of a contradictory way of thinking, which is where a lot of people will think that like an underactive muscle is weakened and an overactive muscle is too strong. And honestly, if you want to describe it that way to your clients, I'm totally cool with that. But it's not a very scientifically accurate definition, because that muscle that's in a shortened position, you don't get me wrong, it's concentrically contracting more than its antagonist. So the antagonist is weakened, it's being pulled into eccentric length, whereas the other muscle is concentrically shortened. But it doesn't mean that it's too strong. That muscle's still weaker than it should be, which is why we do our stretches before we start exercising. Because if you have a muscle that's in a resting position and it's altered and it's not at the length that it's supposed to be, well, you want to make sure that you get it lengthened to exactly an ideal length before you start doing your lifting. So lengthening a muscle beyond its optimal amount will result in reduced force production, but shortening a muscle beyond its optimal amount will also result in reduced force production. And that, I say, is probably our most important concept of the day. So before we move on, yeah, what's up, Andres? Question.
What's the worst that could happen if you don't stretch and you just like, do leg press or something?
Sure. So let's say let's say you don't stretch, let's say it's consistent, right? We'll kind of take your question and we'll put it into a true worst case scenario. So let's say you do the leg press all the time, that's your favorite movement, and you don't ever spend any time doing any mobility movement. Well, let's look at like what the leg press does, right? Like as an exercise, right? Like what muscles are we sort of working when we do this, right? Well, we're seeing that we're definitely using our glutes here. We're performing like a lot of hip extension. Your hamstrings are doing a little bit of work, right? Although in a leg press, the hamstring activation is much, much lower than it is in a traditional sort of barbell squat. So you're really going to get like a lot of quad work instead. So what happens is like your hamstrings, they're supposed to do some of this work, but really your quads are what do most of this. Because if you think about like if you actually like were to take this guy and flip him onto his feet from this position, he's really in a big, excessively forward lean squat, right? Like that's not an ideal squatting position right there, right? The angle of his low back and the angle of his thighs there, they're definitely, crossing over one another. So really what he's doing is using a lot of quad, a little bit of glute, very, very, very little hamstring. So that means his quads are going to be pretty sore, right? So let's say he kind of does that over and over and over and over and over again. He's tightening up those quads, strengthening them even, more and more and more. What's going to happen? But he never stretches. What's going to happen is those quadricep muscles are going to tighten up and they're going to become overactive, while his hamstring muscles on the opposite side of the joint, because they have to compensate for their antagonist here, they are going to do the exact opposite. They're going to get pulled into a lengthened position. And so what's going to happen is he's going to have weak hamstring muscles and he's going to have strong quad muscles, but those quad muscles are also going to eventually get over tightened, and they may be pulling passively for more than the hamstring muscles are, but they still might not be as strong as they potentially could be, because they've actually gotten into a shortened position where they're actually not, there's not a very good amount of like actin and myosin overlap. So he would have like the potential to get stronger, and then it kind of wouldn't happen. And he'd have these really tight quad muscles, which now they're going to resist anytime you go to like lengthen out. That muscle is going to sort of resist, lengthening, because it wants to stay in this shortened position. So if he goes and let's say like does like a really hard sprint or something, and he maybe rapidly stretches his quad into like a stretched position, well, those muscle fibers that didn't want to let go aren't going to. So they're just going to stay in this little bunched up position, which means somewhere else within the thigh, it has to sort of compensate for that lack of movement, usually at the tendon, because the tendon's like a lot stiffer and it's grabbing. So it doesn't have like the contractile element that is happening. So, you know, these fibers are refusing to let go. So now these fibers over here have to compensate, but they're really not designed to lengthen out. A tendon's really like hard, you know, really stiff tissue. So what ends up happening instead is you tear something. Something's got to give, you know. You try to create length where it really couldn't be. And that's likely what would happen. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah.
And that's, I mean, that's what happens, like, you know, that when we sit all day, you know, the reason sitting leads to an anterior pelvic tilt. I mean, you know, I'm in hip flexion, right? Like my hips are in this position. This is hip flexion. So if I sit like this, if I spend 8 hours like this working my desk job, right? These muscles here are just getting tighter and tighter and tighter because they're in a concentric contraction all day. Meanwhile, my glutes, which are in charge of, you know, this or, you know, kicking back this way, right? They are in a lengthened position. So they're getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And so, you know, or, you know, you think about like rounding your shoulders all day, right? Your pecs are getting overly tight and your upper back is getting weak, right? So then one day you try to like open your arms up like this, and these muscle fibers are like, what are you doing? And they just stay contracted. And so then maybe you get like a, you know, pectoral tear, or pull a muscle somewhere, probably more in your rotator. I mean, honestly, probably your rotator cuff, just because they're smaller. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's what happens.
If you don't stretch, obviously, you know, something bad could happen. I just wanted to hear you word it in a, you know.
And you know what's funny is like, I would say like stretching isn't, I want to word this carefully, but stretching is not important for the sake of stretching. You know, like it's a tool that we use to ensure that our muscles stay at an ideal length. So if you've got a muscle that already has like plenty of mobility, it's not overactive or underactive, you have no reason to spend like 2 minutes, you know, static stretching that muscle, trying to get more length out of it, you know? That's how we end up with like hypermobility. And hypermobility is not good either, you know? When we look at like gymnasts, for instance.
Wait, so stretching is not like, well, I mean, a lot of stretching isn't good for you?
I mean, certain types of stretching. Like when we look at something like this, like this is not, these are not like, that is not a natural low back position. Like that is hyper mobility of the low back.
Right.
A lot of times we see gymnasts, they have a lot of shoulder problems. They have a lot of low back problems later in life. They have a lot of shoulder problems later in life. And gymnasts a little bit less than like certain like dancers, but a lot of dance. But like, see this right here? That is, you know, she's in elbow extension, but she's not just in elbow extension. She's in elbow hyperextension.
It's like an abnormal kind of stretch.
It's too much range of motion, right? So, you know, stretching for the sake of stretching, like, it's just like anything else. You should train for the things that you need to get better at, you know? Like me, my hamstrings are really tight. So like I should totally spend time working on like strengthening, but also stretching my hamstrings. My quadriceps, not so much. My quads are really, really loose. That kind of explains why my hamstrings are so tight, right? And so I've got a great range of motion in my quads. So a kneeling hip flexor stretch for me, I don't need to do that. Right? Like all that's going to do is you know, exacerbate the problem. But hamstring stretches, absolutely. So you don't need to stretch every muscle in the body. If you don't have a tight muscle, you know, and when I say like, when I say stretch, I'm kind of referring to like static stretches here, like slow, like mobility improving stretches. Let's say you do have like my quads, right? I really don't need to spend too much time stretching my quads, right? We've established that. But if I'm going to go do like squats and lunges and all this other stuff, it is still good to get like drive some blood flow into the area because you do want to make sure the muscle is warmed up. So the type of stretching that I would do instead of like a big long hold would just be something like butt kickers, something that like drives blood flow into the area, you know, activates the muscle a little bit, gets it going, and that's still going to be really important. So like, so the real answer is like, if you're being very specific about what the definition of stretch is, which means that like, you know, any version of something that drives a muscle through its full range of motion, yeah, you should stretch every muscle. But should you static stretch every muscle and spend like a lot of time trying to over lengthen a muscle? No.
Right.
So, all right. Good question. Let's take a look at our next section. So we're going to kind of get into the sports part of this now, where we've talked about how, like, you know, altered length tension relationships are going to, you know, result in altered movement patterns. Well, one of the other things we got to look at is what's called our force velocity curve. So, you know, I just said that like a shortened muscle is also weaker, right? Like it's weaker than it should be. Well, this is what's kind of cool about this, what we call a force velocity curve. This is your muscle's ability to produce force with an increasing amount of velocity based on their length. So as a muscle, as the velocity of a concentric contraction increases, you start to get further through the full range of motion. Your ability to further produce force decreases. So what that means is, like, as I go through like a full, you know, bicep curl, as I'm getting towards the end, I don't have that much more room to move. So my ability to produce force is going to decrease. Okay. But as the velocity of an eccentric contraction increases, as my eccentric lengthening increases, my ability to produce force also increases. So as I lengthen my bicep, if I'm down here, my biceps at like full length, now it's got plenty of room to create like a big, strong contraction. So it's kind of like the Bruce Lee 1-inch punch, you know? You need a little bit more space to generate more force. Now, like I said, I mean, he's kind of the, I guess that's the 1-inch punch is almost the exception to this rule, right? He's able to produce a whole bunch of force, you know, doing something like that. But he'd be able to produce a lot more force if he were to drive his arm back, you know? So yeah, a little bit of a run up, you know? Like if I had to jump over a gap, I'm going to take a couple steps back and get a running start. So as I lengthen, it allows me to produce more force when I go to shorten. So that force velocity curve is something that we take advantage of in sports all the time. I know I pull this up constantly. I feel like I pull this up every class. When you look at the NFL Combine high jump, the vertical jump that you'll see people do, they're trained on how to do it. You know, they go to like, they get coached on like how to effectively do these. They're going into glute lengthening, right? They're going into hip flexion, which means this muscle is getting stretched out, and they're doing it so rapidly that now there's two things they get to take advantage of. They get to take advantage of that force velocity curve, right? They're in an eccentric length, so their ability to produce concentric force is majorly increased. And number two, there is this thing that happens in your nervous system when you overly stretch a muscle that causes that muscle to panic and contract back in the opposite direction. So when you like overstretch a muscle, your nervous system is designed to kind of, we just talked about like overstretching a muscle and tearing it, right? We just said that it would happen. Your brain's going to try to protect you before that happens. Your nervous system is going to try to, keep that from happening. So what will happen is it will actively contract that same muscle that you over lengthened. And so it'll contract in the opposite direction. So when they throw their arms down, the opposite there, right? Like they're going to try to contract along with it. So that like what we wanted was a big glute contraction, right? So we're getting what we want, and our nervous system is doing it for us. And then that's going to allow us to jump even higher. This is one of the reasons why, one of the things I have kind of a pet peeve when I look at like medicine ball chest passes. You'll see trainers do this. This girl nails it. This guy, not so much. So here's what I don't like about this version of this chest pass. He's going to throw it really hard, which is explosive shortening of his chest muscles. If he ever does it. Okay, so that was really explosive. That was really, really concentrically explosive. But he did not at all train to eccentrically lengthen his chest. All he did was hold it here a little bit isometrically and then explode, right? He didn't do any lengthening. Now this girl here, she nails it. So being closer to the wall and using a bounce ball is allowing her to be explosive in both directions. That means that like she's going to be much more explosive the other way. Oh no, there are 3 cop cars pulling up in front of my very elderly neighbor's house. No. Okay, sorry. Very explosive. Sorry, in both directions. That's what's key here. She's got the lengthening and the shortening. Lengthen, shorten, right? If you are training plyometrics, guys, and you're trying to make a more explosive athlete, make sure that you are training them in all, to be explosive in all directions. The faster you lengthen, the faster you will be able to shorten, okay? So moving slightly out of that, let's go ahead and take a look at our next concept here, which are force couple relationships. So like I said, every muscle has its opposite, right? Every muscle has sort of on the opposite side of the joint, right? One muscle's pulling, the other muscle is going to lengthen, right? Like they're both working. And that's a good thing because like, again, we're kind of thinking of them as opposites here, which kind of sounds a little bit negative, but really, they're working together to create stability on both sides of the joint, right? Like by creating that stability, you're ensuring that that bone can't move too far in any one specific direction. So if I pull here and I pull here, that's great. Now that bone is nice and stable, It's kind of like when you're moving a couch, you don't just put both hands directly. I mean, you can for certain sections of it, but a lot of times, like when you're twisting and stuff, you want to place one hand up high and one hand down below. And that allows you to push here and push here, which are 2 totally opposite directions. That's going to create that rotary movement, right? So you are stabilizing by pulling in both directions of the joint, right? So that's pretty good. We've already kind of talked a little bit about that, the agonist antagonist thing. Well, what about if there's like a helper muscle nearby? Because your glutes actually get a lot of assistance from your hamstrings. They both perform a little bit of that hip extension. So when we have like helper muscles, right? And the way that main muscle plus a helper muscle, plus the antagonist and any stabilizers in the area, how all of those muscles are working together is what we refer to as a force couple. So a force couple are muscles that are working synergistically to produce movement around an entire joint. Okay, so you can see here, this is a great example of several force couples, right? If this person's raising their shoulder all the way up overhead like this, right? If they're doing this full range of motion like this, you can see the upper trapezius is going to pull a little bit this way. The middle trapezius is going to pull a little bit this way. The lower trapezius is going to create stability by pulling this way. Meanwhile, your serratus anterior over here is going to wrap that scapula around the body, right? Meanwhile, your deltoid muscles are contracting, your triceps are stabilizing. All of those muscles are all working synergistically to produce all of this movement together. So we want to train our clients to activate their force couples. This is why we want to make sure that like you're telling your clients to tighten their core while they're doing certain movements, right? Why you're telling them to keep their shoulders in a specific range of motion, right? Now, does me rounding my shoulders back like this before doing like lateral raises, does that necessarily matter for the muscle that I'm using the shoulder joint, right? Not directly, but by pulling my shoulder blades back and like pinching my shoulder blades down and creating stability in the scapula like this, you know, I'm tightening the entire area. I'm creating stabilization and I'm activating all of the muscles that might be used in this force couple. Okay. So it's not always about just like working the one muscle that you're trying to train directly, right? You know, I see it all the time. People doing bicep curls, and they do this kind of thing, right? Or they raise their elbows up. Like they're doing all this. It's like, that's not what we want. We want to keep you nice and stabilized, you know, roll your shoulders down and back, and then do those bicep curls. And it's like, what does rounding my shoulders, what does pinching my shoulder blades have to do with my bicep? Well, nothing directly, but we're trying to we're trying to train the body to be better at activating force couples. How to activate the entire area, keep it stable, hold our joints in the position that we need to hold them in order to move through our complete range of motion. I forgot to mention one of the best ways to imagine a force couple, by the way, picture a steering wheel. You know, if you've got a steering wheel, I'm kind of slightly pulling up with my right hand. I'm going to slightly pull down with my left. That creates stability as I'm like driving. That's a good example of a force couple. Any questions on that, guys? Muscles working together?
All good.
Cool, cool. All right. So next thing we got to look at, we've already kind of talked a little bit about this, but we know that our bones' job is to act as like a lever as we produce movement, right? The bones are rigid, the muscles can contract. And so the muscles are attached to these rigid things. When they contract, that moves, that moves that rigid bone. So if I've got like a deltoid muscle, you can see in the version we're doing here, my deltoid muscle grabs onto my humerus here and it pulls like this. That's going to abduct my arm, right? It's going to contract and raise my arm up like that. So when we're considering like how much muscle leverage has, we got to remember like how long a muscle is, how much like surface area that muscle has, and how far away our resistance is. So that's where we got to talk a little bit about like this concept called torque. Another one of the reasons why we want to move in the way that we are designed to move is because not only is it more efficient and it makes us more athletic and we get things done without risking injury, we don't have to overuse our muscles through specific ranges of motion. So for instance, right, when we're talking about what torque is sort of how heavy something feels based on how far away from the center it is. So if I've got like dumbbells in my hand, right? My dumbbell is very far away from my shoulder joint because my arm is this long, right? So if I go like this and I do lateral raises, there's a lot of torque in this exercise because I'm pivoting from here. And this is like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 feet away. right? That's a pretty big distance. Now, let's say I want to reduce the amount of torque as I do that shoulder raise. Well, all I've got to do is bring the weight closer to the joint that I'm moving. Okay. So if I were to, like, instead of holding that dumbbell in my hand, duct tape it to my elbow and then do lateral raises, that's going to feel a lot lighter. It's going to feel a lot lighter because now the weight is closer to the joint that I'm moving. Okay. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do that. What I would do is I would just say, okay, we're going to bend our elbows and we're going to do our lateral raises like this. And it achieves pretty much the same thing, although there's also a little bit of external rotation that's going to happen there. But the next thing we're going to see, right, when we're talking about torque, is we got to understand that, like, this is one of the biggest reasons why anterior and posterior tilting is so dangerous, right? What this is doing is it's moving my spine away from my center. And then I'm going to kind of collapse here like this. So this sort of anterior action that we're seeing here with this rounding is putting more torque on certain parts of my spine. That means that those parts of my spine are likely are likely to over, stretch or over strengthen. They're going to experience more force than they're really designed to, so they could get injured, right? Again, all comes back to, the reason we're even talking about all this stuff, right? It all kind of comes back to the idea of ideal posture. Without ideal posture, we've got too much torque, which means that our joints are going to experience too much stress. They may not be able to keep up, and we might pull a muscle or injure something, right? And what's cool is, like, based on that lesson, you guys can actually manipulate torque now, like, I don't know if anybody in here likes like hanging leg raises, right? It's one of my favorite ab exercises. It's a really effective, really great ab exercise. So when you're doing a hanging leg raise, there's sort of two schools of thought. There's sort of two ways you can do it. You can hang from that bar, and you can do it like this, where you drive your legs up like this with your knees bent, or you could do the version, I'm gonna kick my bed, where you drive your legs up like this. So which one is more difficult? Well, the one with the straight legs has more torque in it, because all of the weight of my leg is I'm moving my spine, and this is further away than this. Okay, so there's going to be more torque in one version than there is in the other version. Okay. All right, so that's kind of just like a fun little bonus lesson at the end. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about if we we've been talking about all of this because we want to understand posture. Well, now that we kind of understand it, let's talk about how we learn it. How do we teach it to our clients, right? Well, this is where our motor behavior comes in. So motor behavior is the study of how your body, the study of how your kinetic chain is able to create and also learn specific movement patterns, okay? How does your body, like, create a movement, and then how does it remember how to create that movement again in the future? That's your motor behavior, okay? So it's how your nervous system integrates, this internal information that it has, the length of your muscles and things like that, with the external sort of sensory information and previous experiences, right? So looking at that, this is going to be made up of a couple different pieces here. It's going to be made up of your motor control, which is how your central nervous system takes in that information to produce the appropriate response. Remember, our nervous system, we have sensory neurons, that's information going towards the brain. Integrative neurons, which are going to sort of interpret that information. And then we have motor information or motor response that goes back in the opposite direction to move whatever it is you're supposed to move in response. So all of that is your motor control, how your nervous system sort of takes that internal and external information and goes, oh, okay, the last time we lifted something that weighed that much, here's how much muscle we needed to lift it. And then boom, it recruits that much muscle. Now, obviously that's going to slowly change over time as you get, better and better at stuff. Well, that's where motor learning comes in. So when we take motor control and we sort of integrate it with practice and experience, right? And we get sort of just better at it slowly over time, that's what we describe as motor learning. So what we're doing with our clients is we are enhancing their motor learning. The more a move is practiced, the more your body is going to get used to doing it in the future. So that's what we're looking at, right? We want to look at like how we sort of put all these things together in order to get better and better and better at specific movements. The more we practice it, the better you will get at it. That's a two-way street though, because like we are often practicing sitting down, which means we are getting really good at hip flexion, which is tightening up our hips and causes so many of that low back arch that we talk about, right? Causes glute weakness. It is sort of a two-way street. Yes, you can train for things, but training the wrong way, your nervous system's getting used to that, and that's not good. So kind of coming back to proprioception here, because this is all sort of tied together, right? Proprioception, the cumulative neural input from all sensory afferents in the body. Again, I don't really like that definition. I just don't think it's very descriptive. It's your body's understanding of where it is in space, right? You are getting information from mechanoreceptors, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, your joints. All that information is going into your brain, and it's telling your brain what position your body is in currently. So it is how your body is sort of like gathering all of its info. How do you know that you're standing upright? Well, you have sensory receptors that are like, well, gravity's pulling on us primarily like this, right? How does your body know it's lying down? Again, gravity you'd feel it, right? Well, that feeling is your proprioception. So where proprioception sort of meets our job is this concept called sensory motor integration. If we take this information, if we take our proprioception, we take all of our sensory info, and we start to put it together in order for us to like move the way that we want to move, that is sensory motor integration. Take proprioception, take the info, put it together with, all right, well, this is an athletic movement that I want to, produce. Now you have sensory motor integration. Here's the good way here's a good way to think about this, right? For the reduction or stabilization of forces on the body, that's a good reason to activate a muscle. So if your body goes, oh wow, we're reducing force, great. Like if it's okay, we're sitting into a chair, right? Your body's going to know how much force it needs to generate based on like how much it feels gravity and like what your position is in, right? And then the exact opposite is true for like force production. It's like, all right, well, now we want to stand up, right? Okay, well, here, if I lean this far forward to stand up, which is a little bit too far forward, versus like this far forward, I'm going to recruit different muscles in different ways. That is your sensory motor integration. So taking proprioception and putting it together with like desired muscle activation, desired movements in order to like achieve specific tasks, that's your sensory motor integration. So now we got to remember that your sensory motor integration, it's only ever going to be as effective as the quality of your sensory info. You can't choose to move the way you want to move unless you are getting the right type of information into the brain. So the reason we talk so much about posture, we spend so much time talking about like alignment and posture and an active core. We talk about this stuff all the time, is because if your muscle is not at the right length, well, then the sensory information going into your brain is altered. which means that the information coming back and you trying to move in a very specific way can't really happen the way it's supposed to, because you've already like given it the wrong information, you know? Like if I told you that, you know, we are meeting at 9 a.m. somewhere and I gave you the wrong address, you could show up at 9 a.m., right? But like, you know, if you don't have the right address, what does it account for? It doesn't matter, you know, like it's not exactly going to be good, right? So again, this is why we look at our structural efficiency. We want to make sure that we are, you know, keeping our clients in an ideal alignment. If they're in an ideal alignment, they're going to be able to recruit their muscles the way that they're supposed to. All right, so coming back to that motor learning idea, right? We talked about motor learning earlier. It's integration of motor through practice and experience. How do we actually create effective motor learning when we are training our clients? Well, that's how we use feedback. So this, honestly, this end of this PowerPoint here is not something you're probably going to be tested on in this course, because this class is all about like assessing clients. But in the realm of actually training your clients, you need to know what type of feedback to give them. So feedback is the use of sensory information and the way your client feels, sensory motor integration, in order to aid in the development of proper movement patterns. So there's sort of like two sides to feedback here. There's internal feedback and external feedback. Internal feedback is, like I said, it's sensory motor integration. It's information coming in your brain, interpreting and integrating that information with the appropriate response, right? So internal feedback is information from your central nervous system. We can think of this as sensory feedback. You can enhance your sensory feedback by encouraging your clients to feel the difference. When you say something like, hey, how does that feel, right? That is, you are encouraging them to, you know, interpret and sense internal feedback. You're saying like, do you see how that rep was different than like your first one, right? Saying stuff like that activates your client's internal feedback. I go, okay, yeah, I do feel kind of the difference, right? And then there's external feedback, and external feedback is also very good. This is information from an external source. You're an example of external feedback, telling your client like, hey, good job, or like you got 4 left. You know, all of that is external feedback, like good reps, you know, things like that. A mirror is an example of external feedback. A heart rate monitor telling them what their heart rate is, that's a form of external feedback, right? I can't say often I'll be like, man, I'm feeling it. And then I look down and my heart rate's like totally low. And I'm like, oh God, I can push harder. You know, like, thank you, external feedback, you know? And so in the realm of external feedback, we've got sort of 2 subcategories here. There's knowledge of performance, which is literally just telling your clients like, hey, really good job, you know? Good or bad, right? That's your knowledge of performance. But then there's also knowledge of results, and that's about the quality of the movement. So after a squat, if you say, hey, good job, that's knowledge of performance. But then if you said, I like how you kept your hips externally rotated and you kept your chin up and I could see that your core was really tight, that's knowledge of results. So the knowledge of results is like letting your client know specifically what they did right. Knowledge of performance is letting them know that they did well. Both of those are examples of external feedback, but then you would also want to encourage your client to visualize and feel the difference. It's like, do you feel how like when you were driving your knees out, that activated your glutes much better? Again, that is knowledge of, I'm sorry, that's, you know, you are encouraging them to feel internal feedback. All right, guys, let's summarize it up. So each system in the human movement system is interdependent, right? They all obviously work together. They're gathering information, they're interpreting that information, and then they are executing responses. That's your motor behavior, right? Your body is going to use proprioception, its understanding of where it is in space, along with sensory motor integration, where it takes that proprioception and says, okay, well, this is what I want to do, right? And then it's going to use all that to effectively create like human movement. That's why we got to spend so much time understanding what effective human movement looks like. You know, when we are looking at our clients and we are looking at their posture, we need to understand like how to adjust their posture to get them to be as athletic as possible. Last little example here from my life. I was playing Ultimate on Saturday, and there was totally this moment where I tried to juke this guy, but I just leaned over too far because I was like trying to keep my weight like over my heels, but I ended up like leaning way too far over, and I tried to like juke this guy out, and I ended up just running straight into him because I lost my balance. And that was due to like, you know, improper movement patterns. I wasn't able to recruit force in a very effective way. So that is about it for today, guys. Lorianne, Bay, Andres, you got anything for me? How you guys feeling?
I'm feeling good. Sounds good.
Cool, love it. Lorianne, how you doing? You still in the ER?
Yeah, I have a quick question. If you, does RLS have anything to do with the muscles, you know, having the need to be stretched in the calves?
So RLS is not, I'm not super knowledgeable about RLS, first off. I like it's not quite in my wheelhouse. However, I have had a client who had it, and weirdly, the more RLS is kind of a neurological thing. So it is hard for me to think that stretching would have much of a positive benefit. However, the client that I had claimed, like when we did our like leg days in particular, that her RLS was much, much better like the next day. So like burning off a little bit of leg energy, her stretches and strengthening exercises both led to her having less incidents while she was doing it. So maybe I would need to look more into it.
Okay, and it being neurological makes a lot of sense. Since I'm,
Yeah.
you know, my neurological system that's affected.
Yeah, that's cerebrospinal fluid.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Good job today.
Awesome. All right, guys. Homework.
Brad.
Oh, homework 2 goes out today. It is your last piece of homework before we take our first test on Wednesday. So we'll have a 30-question review test that'll cover everything. We got one more lecture tomorrow before that, and then we're going to be meeting in person on Wednesday too, which will be really exciting. So that's our week. I will see you guys tomorrow.